The call came before the morning had fully formed. Too early for good news. Too early for anything except trouble. At 6:12 a.m., Catherine Hale's phone skidded against the wood of her bedside table, vibrating hard enough to wake her before the ringtone had even settled into sound. She opened her eyes into a gray room and lay still for a second, disoriented, not yet awake but already certain something was wrong. Her screen glowed with one name: Carla. Her younger sister never called at that hour unless something had gone bad. Catherine answered immediately. "I know it's early," Carla said, skipping hello entirely. Her voice sounded thick, wrecked, heavy with illness. "But I wouldn't call if I had another option." Catherine pushed herself upright, sleep falling away fast. What happened? There was a pause, then the sound of Carla breathing through it. "I've been sick all night. Fever, chills, all of it. I tried standing up earlier and nearly blacked out." A cough overtook the sentence. "But I'm supposed to be at a house this morning. My best client. If I cancel last minute, they'll replace me, and once that happens, I'm done there. I can't lose this one." Catherine already knew what was coming next. "I need you to go for me." She swung her legs over the side of the bed and rubbed the heel of her palm against one eye, trying to force her brain into motion. "You know I set today aside for research," she said. "I have deadlines." "I know." Carla didn't beg. That was the problem. If she had pushed too hard, Catherine might have resisted out of instinct. But Carla only sounded tired, miserable, cornered. "I wouldn't ask if it didn't matter." Another cough. "It's nothing complicated. Cleaning, laundry, kitchen. Maybe watch his son for a little while if you need to. The owner's hardly home during the day." That made Catherine stop. A child? 6, quiet, keeps to himself. Catherine didn't answer right away, because now she wasn't thinking about the inconvenience. She was thinking about all the other times Carla had stepped in before Catherine even knew how to ask. The semester Catherine had nearly dropped out because she couldn't cover tuition, and Carla quietly picked up extra shifts until the balance was handled. The random transfers when rent ran short. The night 4 years ago when their parents never made it home through the rain, and Carla somehow became the person who called hospitals, signed papers, arranged funerals, spoke in full sentences while Catherine moved through those days like someone walking underwater. After that, they weren't just sisters anymore. They were the last structure either of them had left. "You still there?" Carla asked softly. Catherine let out a long breath. "Send me the address." The relief in Carla's voice came so fast it almost hurt to hear. "I owe you." Catherine managed the hint of a smile. "You already do," she said. "Now you'll just owe me twice." Carla laughed weakly. "Fair." By 8:03 a.m., Catherine understood exactly why Carla had panicked. The place wasn't a house in the ordinary sense of the word. It was the kind of property people slowed down to look at through gates. Tall iron fencing, stone pillars, landscaping so precise it no longer looked natural, only expensive. Even the gravel in the circular drive looked selected rather than bought. Catherine pulled forward slowly and became abruptly aware of her clothes. Dark trousers, plain sweater, practical shoes. Clothes chosen for usefulness. Clothes meant to do a job and disappear into it. Fine for cleaning, not for belonging. She parked near a wide set of steps leading to heavy wooden doors that looked older than her entire apartment building. For one brief, humiliating second, she considered putting the car in reverse and leaving. Then she got out. "You're not here to belong," she told herself. "You're here because someone needs help." She rang the bell. Footsteps came quickly. The man who opened the door looked as though he was already midway through a day he had no patience left for. Charcoal suit, open collar, faint creases at the sleeves like sleep had either been short or irrelevant. Late 30s, maybe. Not handsome in a polished, effortless way, but striking, undeniably. Not because of confidence, because of strain. The kind a person wore when grief had settled into responsibility and never fully left. "You must be Carla's sister." His voice was polite, measured, distracted. "Daniel Mercer." "Catherine Hale." They shook hands. His grip was firm, but not fully present. "Thank you for coming on short notice," he said. "I know this wasn't planned." She said it was important. "It is." He checked the time out of habit more than urgency. "My son is in the family room. He's already had breakfast. Lunch is in the refrigerator. There are instructions in the kitchen." Then he hesitated, just barely. "He doesn't talk much. Catherine saw the tension move through his jaw before he added, "His mother died 3 years ago." There it was, the truth beneath the tired eyes. "Children don't all carry grief the same way," Catherine said carefully. Daniel gave a small nod, though it didn't look like hope exactly. More like a man trying not to give up on it. "I'll be back around 18:30, he said. "My number's written down if anything urgent happens." He took a step toward the door, then stopped again. "He's a good kid." The sentence wasn't defensive. It wasn't performative. It sounded like something he needed someone else to know. Then he left. The house changed the moment the front door closed. It became quieter, yes, but not softer. The silence felt curated, held in place by money, routine, and the effort of people trying not to disturb old pain. Catherine followed the small plastic clicking sound into a large living room, where one section had clearly been given over to a child. Low shelves, soft rugs, ordered toys, everything arranged with care. A little too much care. The boy sat cross-legged on the floor, building something intricate from magnetic tiles. He had Daniel's dark hair and the kind of serious eyes that seemed to take in more than anyone expected from a 6-year-old. Beside him was a worn plush fox with flattened fur and one repaired seam. Not decorative, necessary. Catherine lowered herself to his level rather than speaking down at him. "Hi." No answer. She softened her voice. "My name is Catherine." He didn't look up, but one hand stilled for a beat above the next tile. She noticed. She let the moment stay small. "I heard you're in charge of construction over here," she said. "That looks important." Silence stretched. Then, still not looking at her, he said quietly, "It's a bridge." Catherine kept her tone easy. "What does it connect?" This time he paused longer, as if he was deciding whether answering her would mean anything. Then he said, almost under his breath, "2 safe places." The words settled somewhere in her before she fully understood why. She would think about them later. Much later. At the time, all she knew was that this day had already become something stranger and more delicate than she had expected. As the morning unfolded, Catherine found herself wondering what the real assignment was. Cleaning the house? Or learning how to exist in the same room as a child who had taught himself not to need strangers? "I'll be here today while your dad is at work," she said gently. Ethan glanced at her for less than a second, just enough to show he had heard, then returned to the bridge. Catherine let that be enough. Her graduate work had taught her something many adults missed. Silence in children was rarely empty. Most of the time it was protective, a boundary, a small territory they could still control. She wasn't about to invade it. "That's a strong design," she said after a moment, glancing at the base of the structure. "Using the darker tiles underneath was smart?" No answer. But his hands paused, almost imperceptibly. He was listening. "I'm going to clean for a while," she said, "but I'll be around if you need anything." Then, lightly, "Would it bother you if I played some music?" Quietly. This time he looked at her again and gave the smallest nod. Permission. Not trust yet, but close enough to be treated carefully. Catherine moved through the house with a dustcloth in one hand and her attention somewhere else entirely. Ethan rotated from blocks to puzzle pieces to coloring with an almost ritual precision. Atlas, the fox, stayed near him through all of it, always within reach. He didn't speak, but each time Catherine re-entered the room, his eyes lifted briefly, checking, not out of curiosity, out of caution, making sure she was still there. That, more than anything, told her what kind of grief she was looking at. Children who had lost someone early often learned to monitor absence better than presence. At 11:42, Catherine went into the kitchen and checked Carla's notes. Predictable food, familiar textures, nothing messy, nothing surprising. She made a sandwich, cut it into triangles instead of squares, and added fruit in a loose, curved shape on the plate. Not overly cute, just considered. Something a child might notice without feeling managed. When she carried it into the living room, she didn't interrupt his concentration. "Ethan," she said, "lunch is ready." No response. "Do you want to eat at the table or here?" He looked at the plate, really looked, then pointed to the low coffee table. "Here works," she said. She set the plate down and sat on the floor nearby, not hovering, not withdrawing either. He ate carefully with the same seriousness he brought to everything else. Halfway through, he lifted Atlas and pressed a piece of fruit gently to the fox's mouth. Catherine didn't smile at it or make him self-conscious. She only asked, "Does your friend have a name?" He studied her face for a long moment, as if the question mattered more than it should. Then he answered so softly she almost missed it. "Atlas." Something tightened in Catherine's chest, though she kept her expression calm. "That suits him," she said. "He looks reliable." A tiny nod. Then, after a beat, "He looks like someone who stays." Another nod. That one meant more. After lunch, Ethan went back to the floor. Catherine finished what she needed to finish, but kept finding reasons to circle back through the living room, less interested now in cleaning than in what was happening between them in increments too small to name. A low bookshelf stood against one wall, full of children's stories. Some were pristine. Others had softened at the edges from repeated use. She took a chance. "Would it be okay if I read one?" she asked. No answer. "I do voices," she added. "Not all of them well." That got him. He looked at her directly for the first time that day, stood, crossed to the shelf, and selected a book with grave concentration before bringing it back. Animals, of course. Catherine sat on the rug. To her surprise, Ethan sat beside her. Not leaning in, not touching, but close enough that the gap between them no longer felt like fear. She began reading, not overdoing the voices, just enough variation to make the pages feel alive, enough humor to let the story breathe. Somewhere in the middle, she looked down and saw the change. A smile. Small, cautious, but unmistakably real. They read another book, then another. By the fourth, Ethan was leaning lightly against her arm, Atlas resting in his lap like a witness. When she finished, he looked up and said with sudden clarity, "Again." Catherine smiled back. "Okay," and started over. She sensed Daniel before she heard him. Not noise, presence. He stood in the doorway, still in his suit, briefcase hanging loose at his side as if he had forgotten he was holding it. He wasn't looking at Catherine. He was looking at Ethan speaking, at Ethan smiling, at something he had maybe stopped allowing himself to imagine. "Mr. Mercer," Catherine said quietly, "I didn't hear you come in." He didn't answer at first. When he finally did, his voice sounded rough, almost stunned. "He's talking." Then, like he needed to hear it aloud to believe it, "My son is talking." Ethan looked between them, suddenly uncertain. "We were reading," Catherine said. "He picked the books." Daniel set down his briefcase with exaggerated care, as if any abrupt movement might frighten the moment away. Then he crossed the room. "Ethan." The boy stood and walked into his father's arms with Atlas tucked tightly against his chest. "Dad," he said. "Catherine does funny voices." Daniel closed his eyes for a second when he hugged him. Catherine looked away instinctively, giving the emotion privacy. "And she made my lunch look happy," Ethan added. A broken laugh escaped Daniel before he could stop it. When he looked back at Catherine, there were tears in his eyes, and no real effort to disguise them. He mouthed a silent thank you over Ethan's shoulder. Catherine nodded and started to gather her things, assuming the moment belonged to them. "Please don't go yet," Daniel said. Something in the way he said it made it clear that the day had tilted. Nothing dramatic had happened, and yet everything had changed. Daniel watched them for another long moment, still not entirely inside himself again. Then he looked at Ethan and said carefully, as though he didn't want to touch the moment too hard, "Why don't you show Catherine your room? You can show her the railway." What happened next surprised him enough that Catherine noticed. Ethan reached for her hand immediately. No hesitation, no resistance, no visible calculation. Just trust, offered in the simplest possible form. And then he led her upstairs. His room was beautiful in the way expensive things often were, and somehow that made it a little sad. Soft, neutral walls, carefully chosen furniture, shelving arranged with neat precision. Everything tasteful, tidy, quiet. It looked like a room designed by adults who loved a child very much and were trying with all their strength not to fail him. What it didn't look like was lived in, not fully. There was so little mess, so little chaos, that the room felt curated rather than claimed. Except for one area. In the far corner, a large railway spread across a custom-built table. That part of the room was different. It had energy in it, The tracks crossed and doubled back. Tiny bridges connected painted sections of land. Stations sat in deliberate places. Trees had been arranged with the care of someone constructing a world where movement could be predicted and accidents prevented. Catherine understood it instantly. "This is incredible," she said, and meant it. Ethan relaxed just enough for her to see it. Then he started talking. Not loudly, not quickly, but steadily. Which train was the fastest? Which route was safest? Which turn had to be taken slowly? Which bridge was unfinished because it still needs reinforcing? Catherine asked questions, but she let him own the room. Let him teach. Let him decide what mattered inside this small, orderly universe. And the more he explained, the more certain she became that this wasn't just a hobby for him. It was structure, control, repair. A way of keeping things from going where they weren't supposed to. When they came back downstairs, Daniel had changed. Jeans, white shirt, sleeves rolled carelessly to the forearms. Without the suit, he looked younger and more exposed somehow, less like a person accustomed to being obeyed, and more like a man who had run out of ways to hide how tired he was. "Catherine," he said, quieter now. "Could we talk for a minute?" Ethan went back to the living room and resumed building without protest. That too, Daniel seemed to register. In the kitchen, he stood for a moment with one hand braced on the counter, as though he needed the support. "I don't know what happened today," he said finally, "but my son spoke to you." His composure was mostly intact, but only mostly. He hasn't done that with anyone except me and his therapist, and even then barely. Not with Carla, not with his teachers, not with anyone. He paused and looked down. And today he laughed. He said it like he still couldn't reconcile the sound with the life he'd been living. I'd forgotten what that sounded like. Catherine answered simply. "I didn't try to make him talk." Daniel looked up. "I let him decide when it felt safe." That landed. She saw it land. "Safe," he repeated quietly. "Yes." He studied her now, not politely but seriously. "What exactly are you studying?" "A master's focused on child development, trauma, and grief," she said. "I want to work with children who've experienced loss." For a second, Daniel just stared. That's exactly what he needs. "Maybe," Catherine said. "Or maybe today was just one good day. Children aren't formulas." "But it was a good day," Daniel said. "The first in a long time." Then he took a breath. "This is sudden, and I know that. But would you consider coming back?" He raised a hand slightly, stopping the thought before she could misread it. "Not to clean. I can hire cleaners. That's not the problem." His voice lowered. "The problem is that my son reached for you." He looked toward the living room. "I run a company. Most days I'm paid to have answers, to make decisions, to fix things before they get worse." A humorless half-smile touched his mouth. "But this," he stopped. "This I haven't known how to fix." The honesty in it was unguarded enough that Catherine felt it like pressure. "He has a therapist," Daniel said. "But that's an hour a week. The rest of the time he still has to wake up, eat lunch, move through the house, get through a day." Then, after a pause, "He needs someone in the ordinary hours." The next sentence came softer. "Someone who can make the day feel safe when nothing dramatic is happening." And then, almost embarrassed by how much it meant, "Someone who made his lunch smile." Catherine looked toward the other room. Ethan was bent over the railway, calmer now than he had been that morning. Focused, settled. This wasn't what she had planned for the day. But then very little in her life that mattered had ever announced itself in advance. "Let me talk to Carla," she said, "and think about it." Daniel nodded immediately. "Of course." He reached for his wallet and handed her cash. "Too much. This is more than it should be." "No," he said. The answer was instant. "It isn't." Then, after a beat, "You gave me something today I wasn't sure I was ever getting back." He didn't have to explain what he meant. At the door, as Catherine was gathering her bag, Ethan appeared beside her so suddenly she almost hadn't heard him approach. "Will you come back?" Atlas was tucked firmly under his arm. Catherine crouched to his level. "Do you want me to?" He nodded once, hard. Not shy now, certain. Something about that made the decision before her thoughts had fully caught up. "Yes," she said. "I'll come back." And then Ethan hugged her. Briefly, fiercely with the instinctive seriousness children bring to things that matter. Later, Daniel would admit that watching it scared him a little. Not because it was wrong, because it made visible how long his son had been waiting for someone who felt steady. That evening, Catherine called Carla and told her everything. The offer, the child, the strange certainty that the day had opened a door she hadn't been looking for. She could still have said no, but already somewhere beneath the practical reasons and rational cautions, she knew she probably wouldn't. Carla understood before Catherine had even finished explaining. "This isn't just a job," she said. "This is what you've been working toward for years." Catherine sat on the edge of her bed, staring at the research notes she hadn't opened all day. "It wasn't part of the plan." Carla gave a quiet, knowing laugh. "The most important things never are." A small pause followed. "You help children find their voices, and that boy started finding his because of you." Another pause. "And Daniel Mercer. He sounds like a good man." Catherine didn't respond. The silence answered for her. Carla noticed. "He lost his wife. He's trying to be two parents while running a company. People can function like that for a while, but nobody can live like that forever." Catherine shifted slightly, uncomfortable for reasons she didn't want to name yet. "I'm not saying they need saving," Carla added. "I'm saying what you do matters there." That was the sentence Catherine kept thinking about after the call ended. Not that they needed help, that she mattered, and that was more dangerous. Because helping someone for a day was simple. Becoming important to them wasn't. Over the following weeks, Catherine's visits stopped feeling temporary. Daniel hired professional staff to manage the house. Cleaning quietly disappeared from her responsibilities until it almost became hard to remember that it had ever been the reason she first came. Now her work was Ethan, and Ethan began to change. Slowly, unevenly. The way real healing happens. He spoke more, though never on command and never to reassure anyone. Some days he seemed almost like any other 6-year-old, curious, focused, unexpectedly funny in quiet ways. Other days he withdrew again for reasons none of them could fully predict. A sound, a memory, a difficult morning. Catherine learned to notice the shifts early. Daniel learned that progress didn't follow schedules. The nightmares became less frequent, but they didn't disappear. One evening, Catherine arrived to find Daniel standing outside Ethan's bedroom door, his tie loosened, his voice low and carefully controlled. "I'm here," he was saying softly. "I'm right here." No answer came from inside. Catherine stepped closer. Daniel looked at her with something raw in his expression. Not embarrassment, not exactly helplessness, something deeper. The look of someone used to solving problems who had discovered this was one he couldn't fix alone. "It's been 20 minutes, he said quietly. "He won't open the door." Catherine didn't answer immediately. She simply sat down near the door. "Ethan, it's Catherine." Silence. Then finally, "Only you." The words stayed in the air. Daniel stepped back without hesitation. Not out of jealousy, out of love. Relief and pain existed together in his face, impossible to separate. Inside, Ethan let Catherine sit with him until his breathing slowed. She said very little. She didn't need to. When she came back into the hallway, Daniel was still there. "I should be enough," he said quietly. It didn't sound like self-pity. It sounded like judgment. Catherine studied him for a moment before answering. "He doesn't need one person to be everything," she said gently. "He needs people who stay." Daniel looked down. "I'm trying." "I know." That mattered more to him than she realized. And maybe that was the first moment Catherine understood how easily she could cross from helping this family into becoming part of it. Not because of romance, because intimacy had already begun somewhere else. In exhaustion, in quiet hallways, in being seen when you weren't at your best. But the real test of trust came later, and almost went unnoticed. One afternoon, Catherine mentioned casually that she might have to miss the following day. A university meeting she couldn't move. She said it lightly, not realizing Ethan was listening from the hallway. There was no reaction. That was what made it dangerous. The next morning when she arrived, Ethan didn't come downstairs. Daniel met her halfway up the stairs. "He doesn't want to come out," he said quietly. "Why?" Daniel hesitated. "He thinks you're leaving." Catherine felt something heavy settle in her chest. I only missed one day. Daniel nodded slightly. He knows. That isn't the problem. A pause. He thinks that's how it starts. That sentence stayed between them. Catherine knocked gently on Ethan's door. Ethan, it's me. Silence. Then finally, you said you'd be here. Not angry, just factual. Catherine sat down on the floor outside the door instead of opening it. I am here. A long silence followed. You weren't yesterday. Not accusation. Evidence. Catherine chose her words carefully. Sometimes I'll have to be gone for a day or a few hours. That's how life works. Silence. Then softly. But I don't disappear. Another pause. I always come back. The door opened a few inches. Not fully, just enough. Testing. That was the real moment. Not forgiveness, verification. And Catherine understood then. This was no longer just work. Daniel was changing too. He started coming home earlier, sitting on the floor during games, learning to slow down. Sometimes he still got it wrong. One afternoon he pushed Ethan to answer a question he clearly wasn't ready for. The boy shut down. The room cooled. Daniel realized his mistake too late. Later he stood in the kitchen with both hands pressed against the counter. I keep doing that, he said. What? Acting like healing has a deadline. A tired half smile. I know better in every other part of my life. You can't rush timing. But with him, he stopped. I'm afraid that if he opens up, he might close again. There it was. Not control. Fear. You're not trying to control him, Catherine said. Daniel gave her a searching look. You're trying not to lose him again. That reached him. He didn't answer right away. By the time nearly 4 months had passed, Catherine staying for dinner was no longer unusual. Some evenings simply stretched longer. One more story. One more conversation. A simple meal that no one planned but no one wanted to end. That was what unsettled Catherine the most. Not Daniel. Not the house. How natural it all felt. How quickly something borrowed could start feeling like it belonged to you. One evening, after Ethan had gone to sleep, Daniel asked her to stay a little longer. 2 glasses of wine sat untouched between them. Daniel didn't speak immediately. That alone told her this mattered. I've been trying not to say this, he admitted. Catherine waited. I didn't expect this, he continued. You came here for Ethan. A pause. And you changed his world. Another pause. And somewhere along the way, you changed mine. He looked at her directly now. I think I'm falling in love with you. Then immediately, I'm not asking anything from you. If you don't feel the same, nothing changes for Ethan. Nothing. Catherine felt tears before she realized she was crying. I tried very hard not to feel this, she admitted. Daniel almost smiled. So did I. That broke the tension. It stopped feeling like work, she said quietly. Did that scare you? Yes. Why? Because it started feeling like home. A long silence followed. And that's the hardest thing to risk losing. Daniel didn't argue. That mattered. Because he understood the risk too. When he crossed the room, he did it slowly, giving her time to step away if she needed to. She didn't. The kiss wasn't passionate. It was careful, as if both of them understood how much could be broken if they rushed. You already feel like family, he said softly. Catherine realized she wasn't afraid of that anymore. She was afraid it might be true. Children often understand emotional truths faster than adults. One afternoon, Ethan asked directly, Are you going to stay with us? Catherine exchanged a glance with Daniel. How would you feel about that? She asked. Ethan thought carefully. My first mom is in heaven, he said. Dad says she still watches me. He traced Atlas's worn ear thoughtfully. I think she would want someone here too. A pause. Someone who reads stories. Another. Someone who makes lunch smile. Then quietly, someone who stays. Daniel had to step out of the room for a moment. Catherine pulled Ethan into a gentle hug, and for the first time she allowed herself to consider something she had been carefully avoiding. Maybe this wasn't an accident. Maybe she had arrived exactly where she was meant to be. But she also understood something else now. The more something begins to feel like home, the more terrifying it becomes to lose it. And now, for the first time, she had something to lose. Catherine didn't answer Ethan immediately. Not because she was uncertain, because she wasn't. Because she understood that what he was asking for wasn't childish at all. It was precise, permanent. The kind of question children asked when they had already measured the emotional cost of the answer. She knelt so they were eye level. "If that's what you want one day," she said softly, "I would be honored to love you that way." Her hand rested lightly on his shoulder. "But your first mom will always be your mom. No one takes her place." Ethan considered that with solemn concentration. "We can love both?" Catherine smiled. "We can." He nodded once. That was enough for him. But not for her. Not really. Because from that moment on, love in the abstract was gone. Everything had become specific. He was no longer just a child she helped. He was a child who had made room for her in the most serious part of his heart. And there was no ethical, careful, emotionally literate way to pretend that did not change everything. They married 8 months later in the garden behind the house. Not because it was picturesque, though it was. Because neither of them wanted to stand anywhere else. Not after everything that had happened inside those walls. Not after the hallway outside Ethan's bedroom. Not after the stories on the rug, the railway upstairs. The slow, unremarkable afternoons that had done more healing than any grand declaration ever could. It was a small ceremony. Close friends, a few family members, no unnecessary performance. Ethan carried the rings with such visible concentration that even Carla had to look away for a second to stop herself from crying too early. Atlas was tucked under Ethan's arm, not hidden, not apologized for. Daniel had once worried people might see it as a sign his son was still fragile. Now he understood it differently. Everybody carried something. Ethan just carried his openly. Carla stood beside Catherine and whispered, just before the ceremony began, "I still think I deserve credit for all of this." Catherine almost laughed. "You were sick." "And useful," Carla whispered back. That small moment helped. It made the day feel more lived in, less ceremonial. Which mattered because underneath the joy there was still grief. Not the sharp, incapacitating kind, but the kind that came quietly to important days and stood at the edge of them, asking not to be erased. When Daniel looked at Ethan before the vows began, Catherine knew he was thinking of the woman who should have been there to see her son grown taller, calmer, safer. When Catherine reached for Daniel's hand, it was partly love and partly recognition. Families formed after loss were still families formed with loss in the room. That was part of what made them real. When Daniel spoke his vows, his voice was steady, but not invulnerable. "You came to our house on an ordinary morning," he said. "You were supposed to stay one day." The words were simple, better that way. "You stayed when you had no reason to, at least not one the world would have recognized yet." A small beat passed before he continued. "You gave my son something back that I had started to think was gone for good." His gaze shifted briefly toward Ethan. "And you gave me something harder." Catherine held still. "You made me visible to myself again." That line landed harder than if he had said something prettier. "For a long time, I thought surviving counted as living. I thought if I kept the house standing, kept the business running, kept food on the table and fear out of Ethan's sight, then I was doing what was required." His voice tightened. "But you showed me that love isn't only protection. It's presence." He swallowed once before going on. "You stayed long enough for both of us to believe in that again." Then quieter. "You chose us when choosing us came with history, grief, and no guarantee of ease." His hands tightened around hers. "And I will never treat that lightly." That was the line that mattered most. Not romance, responsibility, recognition, weight. Catherine didn't use notes. If she had written anything down, she knew she would only end up setting it aside. "I thought I was coming here to help a child," she said. "I didn't know I was walking into the life that would become mine." She looked first at Ethan, then at Daniel. Some love stories begin with certainty. Ours didn't. Ours began with caution. A small smile touched Daniel's mouth. "With a child deciding whether I was safe. With a father deciding whether he could ask for help. With a house deciding whether it could hold more life without betraying what had already been lost there." That last line changed the air slightly. Because it was true. Because nobody standing there had forgotten. Catherine held Daniel's hands more firmly. This didn't become a family all at once. It became one by repetition, by stories, by patience, by ordinary days. Then, after a breath, by staying. That word settled over all three of them. And because it was the right word, she didn't try to replace it with anything prettier. Ethan insisted on speaking too. He had practiced, then unpracticed, then decided he preferred saying it his own way. When the moment came, he stepped forward with Atlas under one arm and said, "I promise to always let Catherine do the voices in books." A pause. "And I promise to eat vegetables." Another pause. "Some of them." The laughter that followed was immediate and grateful. Not because the line was funny, though it was, because everyone there needed the release. That was another thing people rarely admitted about weddings shaped by previous loss. Happiness could make you cry almost as fast as sorrow could. Sometimes faster. Years later, when people asked Catherine how she and Daniel met, she never reduced it to something cuter than it was. "I covered my sister's shift for one day," she would say. "I thought I was walking into somebody else's life for a few hours." Then she would glance toward Daniel and Ethan. "But I wasn't." Daniel's version was even simpler. "She came because she was kind," he would say. "She stayed because she was brave." Then, after a beat, "and because she understood that love is not the same thing as rescue." That line tended to stay with people, because it was the truth. She had not saved them. She had joined them. And that difference meant everything. Ethan grew into the kind of young man who made people feel listened to. Still quiet in some ways, still careful, but no longer hidden inside himself. He studied child psychology, though Catherine had once been privately afraid he would resist it simply because everyone expected the story to close that way. Instead, he chose it for his own reasons. Not to repay anything, not to imitate her. Because he knew firsthand what it meant when one person stayed calm enough for another person to come back to themselves. When people asked him why, he sometimes said, "Someone did that for me once." Other times he smiled and said, "She made my lunch smile." And when people laughed, as they usually did, he let them. Then he added more quietly, "That was the first time I remember believing things could get better." That line usually changed the room. It should. Their life did not become perfect. That would have made the story easier to tell, but less true. There were still anniversaries that hit harder than expected. Still moments when Ethan went quiet in a way that reminded them grief was not linear and never polite enough to arrive on schedule. Still nights when Daniel woke from dreams he never fully described. Still days when Catherine felt the enormous responsibility of being loved by people who had already survived loss once and could not help, somewhere deep down, fearing it again. But that was the point. Love had not erased fragility. It had made fragility shareable. They did not build a life free from grief. They built one strong enough to hold it. And in the end, that mattered more. Because the biggest changes in life rarely announce themselves properly. They arrive disguised as inconveniences. Illness, a missed day, a favor answered half awake before sunrise, an early call, a front door opening, a child on the floor building a bridge between two safe places. Catherine had gone there thinking she was helping for a day. She stayed because somewhere between caution and love, she understood what had actually been asked of her. Not perfection, presence, not rescue, commitment, not a miracle. Just the difficult, ordinary courage of remaining. And in the end, that was what they built together. Not a perfect life. A life that could hold. If this story made you feel something, hit that like button. Drop a comment telling us what you would have done in the main character's place. And subscribe to Sinner Stories so you never miss a new video.